Terrific job there by Helen Marriage and her team at Artichoke. Great to have you back. Really, it's far less gloomy looking than Atlanta is today. I'm going to bring in some of the folks that we did just see in the film. Tonya Nelson, she's London Area Director of the Arts Council England. Professor Ricky Burdett, he is Director of London School of Economics Cities, and Daniel Bridge, Program Director of the Royal Docks. Also honored to have with us Justine Simons. She is Deputy Mayor of Culture and the Creative Industries for the Office of the Mayor of London. Thank you all for being here and welcome. I'm going to start with Deputy Mayor Simons because we didn't hear from you in the film. I've watched enough English police procedurals to think I'm supposed to call you Mom. Am I?
No, definitely not. Just call me Justine.
Justine will do. So we heard from others, their observations, and we saw some of the unbelievable transformation of London over the past 20 to 30 years. Tell us about your observations. You've been at City Hall for a long time.
Yeah, thank you, Virginia. And thank you, Helen and the Loeb family for inviting me. Yeah, I guess, I mean, it's a kind of tale of three cities for me. You know, I started in my role at City Hall at the very inception of City Hall when it was created. Lots of people don't know this, but, you know, London has only really had a mayor for 20 years. So if you look at other big global cities like New York, you know, there's hundreds of years that you can go back with the city administration. But we're quite young in London. And, you know, this is really the first time we've had a proper strategic government for London in the last 2 decades. Yeah, and so I've been here from the beginning and worked for all 3 mayors so far. So have really kind of been very much kind of in the middle of the journey for culture and regeneration in London. I mean, I thought perhaps what I try to do is do my best to kind of summarise the 3 parts, the 3 mayors and what happened, the journey for culture and the regeneration of the city within those. So the start of the Greater London Authority, it's really a strategic voice for London. There hasn't been that voice before. I mean, I always imagine it, you know, it was unthinkable that we'd have been able to bid for the Olympics if we hadn't had strategic government in London. We'd have never got our act together because there's just too many moving parts. And there hasn't been that voice internationally, you know, London speaking to the world before. So really important to establish that voice. But the challenge really is that, you know, very kind of new to the party, very complicated government landscape already, very limited powers and not very much money. So when I first started, I kind of looked at the Greater London Authority Act and I had only 2 tasks to do, which was to write a cultural strategy for London, the first one, and also appoint a group of advisors to advise us on that strategy. That's it. And we've really pushed the envelope massively beyond that kind of, you know, the technical task of the job. Yeah, so really, I think in that period, I guess culture feels to me like it's gone from a more niche idea to a mainstream idea, you know, and I think I can see that in cities all around the world where, you know, the original model was really to have a kind of arts department where you'd have officers running festivals, funding projects, etc. You know, and today in city government in London and in cities around the world, culture is a kind of golden thread. It's really embedded strategically. So you can see culture embedded in regeneration projects, in health projects, in young people, in education, all across every single kind of government policy. And that I feel has been the shift overarching in the last kind of couple of decades. But just to give you a kind of run through of the 3 mayors. So the first mayor of London was Ken Livingstone, Labour mayor. Actually he started as an independent and then went back to being a Labour mayor. So with him, I wrote the first cultural strategy. And at that time, it'd never been done before. None of the local boroughs had a cultural strategy. Now they've all got them. So a very big shift in terms of policy. Everyone's really on the game now. And then in 2000, you know, London was a very different place. We didn't even celebrate New Year's Eve. There was no national moment there. There was no Chinese New Year. There was no St. Patrick's Day. There was none of this kind of coming together with cultures and communities. And the first mayor, Ken Livingstone, really saw culture as a unifier, bringing communities together. And that was his big template that he set up. We also did lots of work on really establishing the tentpole creative industries, so really boosting London Fashion Week, establishing a strategic role around growing the film industry in London, which is now 30% bigger than it was, establishing the London Design Festival, and these big kind of emblematic creative economy programs that were, again, London-wide, London speaking to the world. We established a strategy for international tourism, the first tourism agency. We realised that 4 out of 5 people were coming to London for culture, and that's not just from tourism, that's from the point of view of living in London, from the point of view of investing and kind of coming to work here. So the importance of London, of culture to London, was becoming really, really clear. And then the other big thing that happened in that first period was the bid for the Olympics. And for the mayor, the first mayor, Ken Livingstone, he was honestly never a really big sports fan. He was always interested in the Olympics as a catalyst for massive regeneration in East London. He saw it as a way to bring in new transport infrastructure, new housing, and to bring people out of poverty. And that's what's happening now, which I'll talk to in a minute. And then we had the second mayor, Boris Johnson, who's now the Prime Minister. And the Olympics really, I guess, defined his term as mayor. We ran the most ambitious cultural Olympiad. We ran a London-wide festival with 5,000 events. Helen and I worked on lots of crazy projects together. And he had an idea to create a thing called Olympicopolis, which is based on the South Kensington Museums in West London, which were a legacy of the Great Exhibition in 1851. And so he had the idea for that, but just as a kind of conceptual thing, it started to get going a little bit as the big legacy idea, and to have that as the Olympic legacy in the Olympic Park in East London. I think the other thing that was happening in that period was we were starting to track the real challenges around cultural infrastructure. So we were tracking the absolute collapse of grassroots music venues, of artist studios, of pubs, of LGBTQ+ nightclubs closing. We were having high-profile fights to save things, the South Bank skate park, etc., etc. So that term under Boris was really about the Olympics, but also kind of revealing the more systemic issues around cultural infrastructure in the city. And then third mayor, Sadiq Khan, under his term, really, I tend to use the words hardwiring and future-proofing. So he was the first mayor to declare culture a top priority for London. And I guess what we've been doing with Sadiq is translating all of that data and what we know so far into policy, into kind of policy experiments and innovations. We've set up a culture at risk office to kind of deal with the more emergency cases. We've experimented with new zoning. We've got 6 new creative enterprise zones in the city to protect culture. We've set up a new cultural studios land trust to buy buildings and keep them affordable for artists. We've written the most pro-culture London plan, because planning is very important. We've established the London Borough of Culture, which is all about really local culture, culture on your doorstep, the local story. And we've renamed Olympicopolis in the Olympic Park, and it's now called East Bank. And it's the biggest kind of cultural and regeneration project for 150 years in London. So that's the major kind of journey so far. And where we are now, obviously COVID hit, we've got the challenges of Brexit, we've got political challenges with the different government to the mayor. So we've still got, lots of challenges, but, I would say the major shift, as I said at the start, was, really that culture is really mainstreamed. It's kind of embedded in a much more systematic way into the kind of nuts and bolts of how London works and thinks about itself.
You mentioned limited powers and limited budget. I wondered if there's a percentage of the mayor's budget or the city budget that culture and the creative industries take up now.
Yeah, it's tiny, yeah, it's tiny. It's kind of probably £3 million or something like that. Yeah, it's tiny.
But I do want to put a pin in the things you mentioned, East Bank and also COVID, just because of how things have transformed there. But ask some of the others that, if you're talking about some ambitious policy initiatives going forward with this mayor, and some really effective things that have happened. And I want to hear from the rest of you about, because we got a broad view, but not really the specifics on projects or policy initiatives or collaborations that you respectively have been a part of that signal a new way of thinking about placemaking in London or East London. Maybe choose one thing that has worked or hasn't worked. Tonya, I'd love to start with you on that. Is something that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, sure. Because as Justine was talking, I was kind of reflecting on my time in London, because as you can hear from my accent, I'm American, and I've been in London for 15 years. So the two things I was struck by as an American coming to London was the micro level diversity, the neighborhood level diversity. It's different than the United States. In the United States, you could go through your whole life. You know, if you're in a middle class neighborhood, you will only see people like you. Whereas in London, in your neighborhood, you could be in a very, very expensive home, but also be bordering a council estate, which is public housing. So that micro level diversity in London, I think, is really striking. The other thing I thought about culture, and I came to actually the UK to study, get a degree in art history. And what I recognized was that culture, a lot more than in the US, is something that's seen as something that should be a part of everybody's life. And so you have kind of the mayor's office, but you have Arts Council England as well. That's the kind of national development agency for culture and arts, for which now I oversee London as part of that. That's really trying to make sure that everybody has access to arts. And there's a really strategic view to that. And one of the things I did want to say is that the change I've kind of seen, at least in the time I've been around, is culturally led regeneration. Mm-hmm. When I first arrived, was building based. It was quite infrastructure based. It was very much about, we need to build a new museum here or a new dance space. And while I think that's really important in terms of, kind of building up the infrastructure, I think we've kind of started to move to thinking about other models of regeneration that are not necessarily building based. And so the example I wanted to bring up was a program that we have at Arts Council called Creative People and Places. And that program is really about, first of all, we're looking at the areas where their cultural engagement is low, areas of deprivation, there are areas of multiple deprivation. So places in need, where Arts Council decides to invest quite significantly in community-led arts programs. So it's a program in which coalitions of small organizations that are on the ground helping locally. It could be, community or activist organization with a small arts organization coming together and then finding ways to engage the local community, not just in participating in the arts, but actually making decisions about what art they have in their communities. And I think that's really interesting because you're doing two things there. I mean, you are using art as a mode of empowerment about what does my community look like and what is important to me in terms of culture, as opposed to having it kind of a top-down approach to it that says, you're going to put a museum here and you're going to love it and it's going to underpin everything. So I think that's one thing that I've seen in terms of a shift in terms of how we are addressing kind of culture and kind of community engagement in the context of culture and arts.
I want to pick up with Ricky then, because he raised that startling statistic about the life, that years taken off of life as you move out eastward on the Jubilee line. And you, Ricky, you're editor of The Endless City, looked at how cities are doing growth right. What has London done right? Is there something that comes to mind for you? As I know, we're definitely going to talk about the Olympics, which you were the chief advisor on architecture and urbanism for the Olympics. So we'll get there. But is that the first thing that comes for you?
I think that one of the things that London has done well over this 20-year plus period, and this is something that Loeb fellows understand, is build on the city's DNA. There's such a tendency in cities around the world, global cities, new cities, emerging cities, to try and reinvent themselves. I think what is extraordinary about many of the projects talked about in the film and that we're all involved in is that they've worked with, let's call it the historic culture of London. What do I mean by that? London has had, ever since it's been around, which is quite a long time, a series of different centers, right? Whether it's Chiswick in the west, whether it's Greenwich in the east, and Stratford not that far, sometimes called urban villages, right? And I think many of the projects, and actually what Tonya was also talking about, this sort of hyper locality and experience of the local community, Many of these projects are built on literally the physicality and what Justine was referring to, the culture of the place. You know, one example is obviously the Olympic project itself. I mean, Stratford has been there for a long time, a very mixed, very diverse neighborhood, very typical of London's sort of inner city outer edges with mixed communities and all that. And it's become a place where I think the average age of people who move there and families who move there is absolutely extraordinary how rich it is. And if you interpret a park and a public space as part of urban culture, which is where Justine and I completely align, that's very important not to separate them out. The space of culture is as important as culture itself. Then, you know, you go to a neighborhood which only 15 years ago was literally, and I don't mean it negatively, a place where stuff was dumped. It was where tires were burned. And it's now a place which is genuinely full of life and large amount of housing and the sort of cultural activities that have been referred to. I mean, the greatest victory, I have to say this before Dan says it. Dan is the great hero of the story of victory. Why? He's got the whole bloody GLA and the mayor to move from one side of London to the other, well, from the south to the east. And, you know, actually that's going to a core point, which connects to what I was saying about London's organic DNA, that London has a flexibility about it. It actually does, because it's a messy city. You know, it's not Manhattan, it's not Paris, right? It's not perfect in many ways. It's been able to play with this a bit like an instrument. And when Helen Marriage introduced herself and said, you know, why should she become a Loeb Fellow? Because what Helen does with other extraordinary cultural entrepreneurs in the city, she plays the city like an instrument, right? And that instrument is there to be understood and played with. And I think the planning regimes of the last three mayors, in one way or another, have actually been continuous, Justine, actually. They're not that different one from the other, despite different sort of political colors. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the city.
Well, Dan, the great hero of London, we would love to hear from you, of course. So Tonya mentioned something about the changes and transformation had often been sort of culturally led in terms of buildings. And you talked about regenerating infrastructure, but how are you balancing that with the human? How do you calculate that in your work and in your plans for the docks of London?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question. I think you do need to bring the two things together, actually. And I'm going to talk probably a bit more about it from an urban planning point of view. But I think, you know, fundamental thing that this administration's done, actually all the administration's done, is building this concept of genuine mixed use development, but also mixed tenure development. So when I first started my career about a similar time as Justine, when City Hall was being set up, that was really quite a radical policy at the time to make developers build genuine mixed tenure developments where you do have people living in social housing alongside, you know, higher value apartments, and that's sort of fundamental to continuing this sort of historic fabric of London and a real genuine mixture of people. So I think that's something that's really important. I think the other thing, it's, you know, strange to look back now, just over 20 years, but just how we rely very much in London on the private development sector to deliver most of our development. And I think Ricky was involved in this, but the Urban Task Force, it's, you know, looking back actually how poor and how few skills there were just around master planning and good urbanism and architecture. And I think the work that was done with Richard Rogers and the Fersmer, Ken Livingstone with Design for London really incredibly enhanced the whole of the private development sector, actually to a point now where I think, you know, most of the good developers, the ones that we work with on very large sites, there's just not a need for the role for Design for London as there was 20 years ago, just because I think that the industry has really caught up with really quite good quality urbanism and thinking about how you genuinely build high density development, which is mixed tenure and mixed use, and have some really good outcomes. And then I think just touch on the culture piece, because you we at the Docks, we fought really hard to have culture as a really important component of the stuff that we do. And it features as part of every part of our delivery program. So we do economic development, we do built development, we're doing community engagement and standard cultural activity. But it really is an important tool for every element of the program of activity. And I think Justine knows this. It's actually it's a really quite a challenging part of the program, because there are certain parts politically in the city that don't understand the value of it and give us, Justine and her team, an incredibly hard time about investing in the value of investing in culture, and that does make it challenging and difficult and politically difficult sometimes for the mayor to support things. But the approach that we're taking in the Docks is very much what Tonya was talking about, and we're really proud to be part of the Creative Places and People's program, which is really a bottom-up approach to developing culture and investing in that sort of grassroots culture. I think we're very much about sort of investing in production rather than we quite frankly don't have the money to invest in the big bits of infrastructure. So we're taking a very different approach, which is just supporting that grassroots local culture and really shining a light on a lot of culture that I just don't think people have realised is there. So there's a few points to start the discussion.
Well, right. I mean, culture is a nebulous word, and I think the case for culture is often this political or economic equation that you are making. How many billions of pounds are generated by cultural industries, and how many jobs are created versus the cost of support? And we know in the U.S., municipal budgets, arts, culture, those are the first things that get cut, especially in times of crisis. This is something that we think of culture as optional. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe Justine, begin with you on how you actually make that case. And I'm imagining much more difficult during a pandemic.
Yeah, how do you make the case for culture in a pandemic?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, there's a related question here actually from Tracy Metz, Loeb. It's painful and inspiring to see how you emphasize how important culture is for London, the very last sector allowed to open in our ongoing lockdown in the Netherlands. Do you have any inspiring stats for us about the economic value of culture for London, since that seems to be what makes our politicians here sit up and take notice? And again, I encourage other questions from people who are listening.
Yeah, 58 billion.
There you go. There's a big one.
58 billion is how much the creative economy is worth in London pre-pandemic. UK-wide, it's worth 112 billion pounds. And just to put that into context nationally, the creative economy is worth more than the automotive, life sciences, aerospace, oil and gas industries put together in the UK. So it's a really big part of the story economically. Pre-pandemic, it was growing very fast. I think 3 times more than the economy at large. And also the other good thing about it is the jobs tend not to be at risk of automation. About 90% of the jobs won't be done by robots. As I always say, you can't automate the imagination. So all of that is really good stuff. But it's not just about the things that you can count on the spreadsheet. So when we're talking about culture, we're talking about a really kind of broad range of, kind of value statements, really. So, really big push in London to put arts into health. We call it social prescribing. So instead of getting drugs, you get you get different kind of activities. And we are piloting ideas to get kind of the arts and cultural activity into the health system, in all aspects really of city policy. So it's that kind of wider piece, I think. It's kind of having all the arguments to hand. But honestly, I think, if you're in these jobs in government, I always say that it's a combination of data and jeopardy. Working with colleagues at Bloomberg, I'm sure you've heard Mike's phrase where he says, in God we trust, but everyone else bring data. Whereas I kind of like to take that a bit further, and I don't think data is enough. I think I call it jeopardy, but what I really mean is you've got to have a story, because we're human beings and that's how we understand the world. You have to have a good, competent data set to show what the potential is, what the problem is, but you also have to have a compelling narrative. So for example, we've been tracking the collapse of artist studios in London, and that it's not enough to say we're about to lose 5,000, that's kind of a third of our production capacity. That's not enough to make the case. It's, what is the wider story there? The wider story there is the creative economy is completely made up of individuals and SMEs driving this £60 million industry in London. And if they've got nowhere to make their work, they're going to disappear, right? So it's making that kind of wider, compelling argument. And if we don't have that, we'll have big talent drain, the kind of the kind of wind will go out of the sails of the thing. So, lots of the stuff we've been doing at City Hall with Sadiq is hardwiring that in. So for the very first time now, affordable artist studios are protected in the London planning system. That was unthinkable kind of 10 years ago, but now it's in there. We've got trusts set up to, buy affordable studio space in perpetuity. We've got new zoning. Ricky knows about this. We've set up new creative enterprise zones in the city to allow artists and creatives to put down roots. And all of those kind of innovative policy ideas ultimately grow out of the kind of argument and the case building, which I think is, this data and the compelling story or the jeopardy of what doesn't happen. But I do absolutely believe that it's not just about telling the economic story. It's got to be about the human story as well, the human connection. And I think during COVID, that's really it's really gone front of mind. Where have we all turned to in the pandemic? We've been kind of watching films on telly, we've been listening to music, we've been joining virtual choirs, we've been painting pictures. It's been a kind of help for us in terms of our mental health and also in combating isolation. So, it's this, it really does kind of work across all aspects of, city policy. We call it a golden thread in the World Cities Culture Forum, which is a global forum that I chair.
There are many layers and meanings of culture. It's the theaters, museums, restaurants, and actually, as where you were talking about the story, the individuals who are working in studios or in collectives. But culture is also tradition and other notions that are hardwired into the minds of older Britons, like the dream of the single family terraced house that doesn't scale in higher density living. It's a really difficult thing to shake. So we have the urban context certainly shifting, but has the thinking of urban residents and how they think about living in London shifted along with that? Daniel, you brought that up in the film. Is there anything that you want to say about that? How is this dying out? Is this shifting?
I think, make a couple of comments, and Justine, you might want to jump into this, but people might have been following in the UK, but in response to sort of the George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter, there's been a massive debate around how our culture is represented in the public realm, and Justine and her team have set up a commission to look at that, because it's quite apparent that that it's definitely not. So London is an incredibly diverse city, and in our monuments, in our plaques on walls about where people lived, in the design of spaces and names of places, it hasn't represented London's rich history. So I think there's definitely something about people's experience of and recognition of culture in the public realm and in the built environment. And as part actually of the relocation of City Hall, we went through a really interesting creative engagement process to rename the road that the new City Hall is on. It's actually called Camel Country Way, which is a sort of a very famous race relations pioneer that was very active in the docks in the 1930s, and actually the vast majority of the names and places doesn't recognise very many people that made a massive contribution to the sort of the economic and social life and fabric of the docks. So I think London, I think, is doing some really interesting work in making sure that we're trying to rectify some of that and doing some really interesting projects and programs. I think Ricky wants to jump in.
Mm-hmm.
On the point that the question you asked, and Dan has just made about how are people adapting to not living in the Georgian terrace, right? So I think the first point is this, that actually most new Londoners were not born in London, and many were not born in the UK. So thank God. And I mean that in a very positive. Tonya is one of them. No, but in that sense, you have a quite a fluid population. There's a degree of churn, and I mean that in a very positive way. And also there's an acceptance that you don't live on the same street in the same house for the whole of your life, right? And I think that's something Dan also alluded to, that, you accept that you might live in an apartment for 7 years of your life, then you might move somewhere else and all that. I think an issue, and I know we're talking about culture and urban culture in particular, but an issue which is fundamental to London's broader DNA is public transport. Mm-hmm. None of this conversation could happen if London didn't have this amazing investment, 150 years old, of a public transport system. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, it's been creaking, but it's extraordinary what it allows people to do and to get to the places that, Justine has been talking about. You couldn't have a cultural enterprise zone, one of Justine's major inventions. It's a fantastic idea. If you couldn't get there, and if you couldn't get there cheaply. And equally, of course, the housing agenda connects that. We did a study at the LSE of people living in exactly the high density developments that Dan has been talking about over the last 5 years. And actually, you find that people are relatively happy to live in these spaces for X periods of their life, as long as they've got good open space and good public transport next to them. So it's a question of design.
Yeah, and I mean, I just jump in there again, Ricky, because I think you're absolutely right. Actually, the quality of the design and the learnings that we've made over the last 20 years, we sort of started out on the process with Design for London, and there's been so much learned about how you design and manage the space, and issues around shared entrances and lobbies, and actually, what we find with the population that's moving into the docks is it's incredibly international. So I think Ricky's right. They probably haven't grown up and lived in a traditional London terrace house. But actually, the lifestyle that they're leading, this type of built form really lends themselves well to a more modern style of living. So, they have concierge facilities and places to drop parcels during the day. There's places for them to work on the ground floor. There's shared spaces for watching films and hanging out with friends. They're really sustainable, so you're not paying high energy prices. We've got combined heat and power systems in there, so that they really are genuinely sustainable. And I think more and more people that experience these sort of types of environments and go and look at them, you do start to beg the question about why would you want to live in a Victorian terrace, as much as that, as nice as they are. Actually, for a period of people's lives, it's a really good thing to do. And the economics, so I guess big thing from London, people probably may know this, but shared ownership as a concept is a really big thing in London. We have a very big housing association sector, and I talked a bit about middle earners in the film, a really important way for people to get safe, secure accommodation and get their foot on the housing ladder is through something called shared ownership, where they buy a proportion of a property and the rest is owned by a housing association. Clearly they're in big developments, but also for the first time, I know you get a lot of this in the States, but institutional private rented development is really significantly driving development, particularly in East London, which means that we're delivering, at a much greater pace than we've delivered before. But it means that you're having professionally managed blocks and people are living in properly managed rented accommodation, rather than history of dodgy landlords and leaky old windows and leaky pipes in old Victorian properties. So I think there's a genuine shift about how people are living, and it lends itself well to that sort of new way of life.
Yeah, I was surprised to read that a full third of all residences in central London, these are now second homes. They're investment homes or holiday homes. This is according to 2011 research that I found anyway. And this is, Chelsea, Kensington, the city of Westminster. So obviously they're being a little bit more expansive and thinking about things in a different way as you go east, as you're changing the placemaking. How much of that is about policy, however? You talked about institutional private development. So that's an initiative on one hand. Ricky mentioned in the film, there is no way that the city governments can only go so far. So central government subsidies can be a part of that. But how are we looking at what is the partnership like with corporations and with other developers? Maybe this is something Justine can speak to, especially because of the developments at East Bank.
Oh yeah, gosh, so much to say. I'm speaking to you, by the way, from a Victorian terraced house.
So you're all in.
I'm all in. But interestingly, I live in a place called the Elephant and Castle, which is, you know, right next door to a massive social housing project that has been completely demolished and rebuilt. And it has been quite controversial. It was, I guess, Dan, it was one of the less successful kind of social housing developments in the kind of 60s. It didn't have, you know, all of those kind of services around it. It wasn't well maintained. And just to the point of policy, you know, I mean, when all this new stuff around me was commissioned, the definition of affordable housing under the previous mayor was, I think, 80% of market value, i.e. not affordable. So now it's you know, it's more pegged to income, and you know, 50% of all new developments signed off by the mayor have to be affordable, pegged to kind of real life incomes and things like that. But those kind of things, those new policy interventions, that, you know, it's a decade before you see any kind of real life, you know, changes on the ground. But yeah, I think also worth picking up your point. I think that the centre of London. Mm-hmm. We might get on to later, but you know, one of the reasons that the pandemic has hit the centre of London harder than any other world city is in part to do with the lack of residential. So there's a triple whammy going on, where you've got no one who really lives in the centre of London in the same way that they do in Manhattan or in the centre of Paris. You've also got people working from home, so people not going into the office, and we've got the collapse of international tourism, and London's has the most international visitors of any world city. So it's been a kind of existential crisis really in the centre of London because of COVID. Just to pick up on that point about residential has really kind of left us exposed really in the pandemic, very particularly. But yeah, to talk to East Bank. So East Bank is my pride and joy. It is, you know, super exciting, big new development, cultural education district legacy in the Olympic Park. And there will be quite soon a new BBC, a new V&A, a new Sadler's Wells dance venue, and brand new London College of Fashion and UCL University. It's a £1.1 billion investment. You asked me about our budget, actually. My basic strategy is to spend other people's money.
I like your style.
So yeah, spending Dan's money, spending East Bank's money. It will really be, I think, a game changer, because the thing about Olympic parks is that, you know, the legacy is often kind of talked up at bid stage, but then, you know, it's very difficult to actually deliver it. You know, and over in East London, the Olympic Park is the biggest regeneration project now in Europe, in the whole of Europe, the biggest new cultural district since 1851. There'll be, when it's done in a few years, 10,000 students at colleges doing courses every day. You know, there's a world-class kind of swimming centre designed by Zaha Hadid that when you go to it, you pay the same that you would pay in any municipal public swimming pool. Loads of housing, new schools. You know, it is a really big endeavour. And as Ricky said, the transport is absolutely key to that. You know, we'll have Crossrail moving over there and the new East London lines and all of that. But the whole centre of gravity is really shifting east in London, I would say. And the Olympic Park is a kind of big engine, I guess, within that. And that is a really big public-private partnership. Sponsors, philanthropists, developers, central government, London government. You know, it's a whole mix of kind of finances and partnerships and relationships to deliver that endeavour. But yeah, it will, you know, it will really kind of shift the dial, I guess, shift the centre of gravity in London over the next decade.
So I've got a couple questions here from people about housing and how that supports kind of cultural diversity. Again, going back to Ricky's point, everybody mentioned the affordability as a number one or a very big challenge. So Washington Farhado, how does housing support cultural diversity? And can you speak to that? Maybe I'd also love to hear from Tonya about, you mentioned how the creative industries have suffered during COVID and how arts and artists. You know, we've seen the pattern before. People who are groundbreaking in neighborhoods, artists often move in for cheaper rent, and then a place becomes cool, and then the bars and the restaurants move in, and then they can't afford it anymore. Why don't we go first to Tonya about that? How artists are existing in this ecosystem right now, and maybe talk a little bit about from Ricky and you all about how housing can actually support that cultural diversity.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one thing is to point to something that Justine already mentioned, which is Arts Council, the mayor's office, and other partners got together to think about artist spaces particularly. And we have a program called the Creative Land Trust that's all about making sure that we secure affordable spaces for artists within London. I think the goal is to have 1,000 spaces across London that will be, available to artists at a fairly low cost. So that's one thing that we've done that was pre-pandemic that I think will be even more important now going forward. I think it was really interesting to go through this COVID and understand at a policy level how to support individual artists versus organizations, because in a way your policy can be that you're supporting organizations that support artists in turn. And so I think a lot of the kind of the money that was invested as emergency funds during COVID in the period that we've been have gone to organizations, but there have been great kind of underpinning programs that have helped support artists, individual artists, and to keep their practice going. So we've put together a program called Developing Your Creative Practice, which allows people to get stipends to spend time kind of developing the practice even more. And I know in the mayor's office, they've done a lot of programs in order to support individuals to continue to, continue to be able to work. But it's a very hard balance to come to in terms of when you're thinking about the entire arts ecosystem, and then thinking about how to direct funding to make sure that the whole supply chain stays vibrant, and where there's a lot of push and pull there. So we've tried to balance it out through the period. Was there another part to your question?
Well, also I'm wondering about when you have a big development like East Bank, I'm not sure who was living in that section before of that region, but what happens to the displaced population? We have an example right there of how pressure on land can drive people out. Yeah, and I don't know if Justine or would like to speak to that.
Ricky, yeah. Do you want to respond to that, Ricky?
Please do.
Take that.
I'm happy to. I mean, so I think one of the really interesting things about the Olympic Park is, and Ricky mentioned this, actually it was pretty underutilized, very contaminated, dirty, poorly accessible land. It's not to say that there weren't some businesses there, but there were some very generous relocation policies put in place for them to relocate to other parts of the city. And actually, there's some of them in the Royal Docks that were relocated from the Olympic Park, and I think, similarly from a docks perspective, because it's ex-Dockland, it hasn't had anything built on it for 30 odd years, and there weren't people living there before. So, some of the tensions that exist in other redevelopment projects in the city. So the one that Justine mentioned earlier, Elephant and Castle, which was a refurbishment or the redevelopment of a local authority housing estate, that was very politically contentious because there was an existing community. One of the great things about the East London story is there's some very big significant tracts of industrial land that are just not very well utilized. So nobody's been displaced. That's not to say I don't think that some of the local residents feel threatened by the very vast, big, quick new development that is happening around them. They definitely do, and I think they do see that as a challenge to their identity. And I think that's why the work that Arts Council are doing with Creative Places and People, and I know that Justine's got a really massive program to make sure that those cultural institutions, before they come in, are doing a huge amount of work with local creative organizations and local people, so that when they do land, that they'll be that they'll feel as though they've been engaged with, and people feel as local people feel it's for them. I think we're pretty good at that stuff, but there is ultimately always a tension, and I think we talked a lot about affordable housing. And that's tricky, but actually that's one thing that's quite easy to sort out, because we've got housing associations, we've got government funding, you can get affordable housing through the planning policy. One of the really critical things from me and the work that we're doing in the docks is it's no good having all of your affordable housing on site if the people that live in it can't afford to grab a coffee in the cafe that's on the ground floor because it's a really cheap cafe, and actually it's only it's only really designed for the people that are there. And again, so we're doing some really interesting work in the docs on that to make sure that the public spaces are informed and influenced by people who already live there and who live in the affordable housing, and we're absolutely making sure that there's that there's cultural activities and spaces and places that are affordable to them, not just the affordable housing. And again, just being some very Ricky, go on.
Yeah, just add, Victoria, Washington's question about policy, housing, and all that. I'd say two things. First of all, we're talking about Loeb Fellows. One of the Loeb Fellows actually became the first chief executive of the Olympic Park Legacy Company and the Altman. So he may even be listening in. So many of the things we're talking about here were laid out by him. But the other thing I would say is maybe being a bit controversial. You can't plan for everything. You can't design everything. I mean, the artist creative communities are also about messiness and edge conditions. You can't create every single 21st century artist, as Justine knows, just by giving them a grant. I think this is where just providing the housing in quirky areas, and I think this is one of the really interesting things about the current housing London plan, as it's called, which looks at housing, is that it also identifies areas that the mayor either owns directly or owns through Transport for London, which are sort of leftover messy bits in between the tracks. And I'm simplifying it just because of time. The suggestion is that there, the affordable quota should be even higher than elsewhere, right? And that's actually how you're going to create, I think, an undercroft of potential talent without being too prescriptive.
Ricky, I want to come back to you though, because we were mentioning again the Olympics and how that accelerated progress really in addressing, improving density, certainly reducing inequality on some level, spreading, sharing the population or the wealth of the area and changing the way that people's lives are living there. But, of course, there are many debates about whether hosting the games is an economic boon or a sinkhole. Plenty of decaying Olympic villages throughout the world to attest to it possibly being a sinkhole. Why, in your work with the planning for the 2012 Olympics, why did it work? I knew there was a lot of citizen pressure, groups who would not support the bid based on conditions, but why do you think it worked in London in a way that it hasn't in other places?
Well, first of all, it's not just an invention of the 2012 Olympics to invest in East London, Dan and others, but I'd say it's been the policy of central London government for the last 40, 50 years to rebalance what is one of fundamentals London's really sustained inequalities, an affluent West and periphery and a more deprived East. It's been there for many, many, many generations because of the docks and the history of London and the river and all that. We don't need to go into that. The reason I think the project worked, I think the twofold. One is that the Livingston administration and the Blair government, and particularly Tessa Jowell, who was the Minister for the Culture at the time, saw this as a regeneration project. It wasn't seen as a sports event for 2 weeks at all. And it was sold with that notion. And actually the intellectual principle was one of, could we measure in 20, 30 years' time success by saying that the life chances of people living in the 5 Olympic boroughs would be the same as people living in, say, West London or elsewhere. We haven't got to that, but it's only 12 years down the line, but certainly things are shifting. That's one part of the answer. The other one is that we copied those cities that did it well, and we ignored those cities that did it badly. Mm-hmm. So we copied Barcelona. Mm-hmm. And Barcelona had a very simple plan, physical project to reconnect the city to its waterfront, create more housing, do all the things they did. And we sort of done the same by restitching, as Dana said, what was a sort of pretty abandoned piece of railway goods yards and burnt tires. Of course, some people live there and many people work there, but not as much. So that sort of transformation was at the heart of the bid and the people behind it. But I think it's important that all of us who happen to be involved for some time also picked up an approach that the great planner Peter Hall and many others had been talking about for really generations.
And I think some people probably don't understand the geography of London, but it was a real barrier to the connection between everything that lies east of the Olympics, because it was so polluted and crossed with fairly chunky bits of infrastructure, power cables and those sorts of things that, without the £10 billion worth of investment, you never would have had the connection. You never would have connected that eastern part of the city into sort of the main bit of inner London. And I think that's what the Olympics has achieved. It's really genuinely connected.
Literally, one statistic, Dan. There was one road, Carpenter's Lane, going from east to west of this massive site, and there are now 53 cycle routes, pedestrian routes, and other routes which make this piece of cities to connect.
Well, Justine spoke a little bit about building, and Tonya as well, programs that are building resiliency into the people who drive this culture and cultural economy. Would love to spend some time talking about resilience that Dan mentioned in the film about climate change, and just want to let everyone know we've got about 15 minutes left. So please do, if you've got questions for the panelists, please do submit them into the chat at the bottom of your screen. I'll get to as many as I possibly can. But Dan, you mentioned COP26. Obviously, this is the climate change conference, was in Glasgow end of last year. So are there significant benchmarks? Are there things that you are looking for? Are you and the mayor's office looking into to create a new plan, create specific goals that you're looking for climate resiliency in East London and London in general?
Yes, so I mean, I think the mayor was doing this anyway, but I think it's really the profile of it's really increased within City Hall, and I'm sure Justine's party to lots of the conversations on this. But I think in many ways, from a London perspective, because of where we are, we're pretty lucky from a climate change point of view, in that unlike probably a lot of other global cities, our risk is much lower than other global cities, but there are definite risks that are out there, and particularly where projects that I'm involved in the Royal Docks, there's a flood risk is a genuine potential issue. So we the nature of our developments and some of the work that we do around working very closely with the Environment Agency around sort of flood risk management and walls and use of ground floor things like that are very, very high in our thoughts. But big lots of discussions around things like overheating and how do you design buildings. We're designing them incredibly energy efficiently, but there's some real issues around how you design them to make sure that they don't overheat in the long term. And I think flood risk just through sort of heavy rain events have really become quite problematic in the city recently. So it's there, and it's definitely gaining more traction.
Karen asks, what forms of inclusion are happening around happening around energy and waste? What is the leading energy like? What's being used?
So again, it's another great thing about, it's the other great thing about East London and the scale of the development that we're delivering, because we're able to build in proper combined heat and energy units up front, and so because lots of this land is public sector owned, so the Royal Docks is owned by the Mayor of London. On the south of the river area called Greenwich Peninsula, where the Millennium Dome is, again, that's owned by the Mayor of London, and we've been able to work with our development partners there to really put in the infrastructure before the developments come through, so that we have really good energy and waste solutions. Yeah, it's one of these are the things, because you've got so much development in a big place, it makes all of those things so much more easy and affordable to do.
Well, that's something you talked about as looking toward the future, regenerating industrial sites, retrofitting industrial infrastructure. Are there examples? You mentioned how things had changed in the East Bank, but are there other examples of how that has been done successfully in East London or London at large? And what comes with that? What kind of money, what kind of funding, what kind of initiative and political will has to come with that?
Well, I think, I mean, coming back to the sort of 20-year piece.
Can I stop you 1 second? Because there's a great question here from the
No, go for
about
it,
that. I'm curious about the source of funds for the big initial investments in infrastructure and housing, GLA access to national funds, or is it locally generated? Question mark from Gil.
So I think it's a combination actually of it comes back to the sort of the joint venture type approach. So we have development partners to develop our sites with, and they're jointly funded. But I guess there's generally two big funding components to what we do. Because of the affordable housing element, the Mayor of London does control a very, very significant affordable housing investment pot that comes from central government. So this current programme period is over £3 billion. And so we work very closely with a very established, what's called a housing associations sector in the UK to provide that affordable housing. And actually that grant that comes from the Mayor of London to provide the affordable housing goes a long way in really helping with some of the upfront infrastructure on the big development sites. But we also have access, and we do fund things like infrastructure through the Mayor's property company, and he uses a sort of we use our property assets to sort of fund things against future revenue streams.
It's probably worth noting, and Justine will add to this, that actually these powers and money have only come through relatively recently. I mean, the mayor had to fight and sort of it was a sort of creeping powers and creeping budgets. I mean, Justine.
I was going to say that, yeah. I was going to say that I think since the establishment of the Greater London Authority, that's what we've really been doing. We've really been trying to kind of establish more powers to act in London. People might not realise this, but the system in the UK is very, very centralised government. So in London, we keep 7% of the taxes that we generate in the city. We only keep 7%. In New York, the administration keeps 50%. In Tokyo, it's 70%. So we're working with quite a small amount of money, and we are always in a kind of tussle around what we call devolution here. Mm-hmm. So always we're wanting devolved power into London. We're wanting more say and more control and to have more leadership. Because as Dan says, this money is always about a funnel from government. And of course, when the government is of the same political party as the mayor, that's great. When they're not, that creates a big headache for us, which we're seeing right now, because the big kind of narrative at the moment from national government is called levelling up, which essentially is levelling down London. So a lot of the funds that are coming through, London is unable to access, funding's getting kind of moved around with a political lens on it, I guess. So we would always want, whatever administration is in, to have more devolved power in London so that we've got more control, and the democratic process can work, in a stronger way, really, in London. That people who you elect in have more power to change things that affect you on a day-to-day basis. But that is a journey, really, isn't it, Ricky, that we are on?
Well, you mentioned at the beginning one of the challenges presented by Brexit, and you're talking about the sort of political culture of London being distinct from other parts of the country. Certainly, it was majority voted to stay in the European Union. So everybody so far has identified vibrant culture springing from the energy that a diverse population brings and diverse kind of projects. But how about this residual, monoculture thinking or identity, maybe underlying racism exposed by Brexit? Where is that figure into impediments to a more cosmopolitan, more European thrust, both in the culture and in building?
Do you want me to answer it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, as Ricky said,
it's a big, complicated question, I realize.
Yeah, London is a remaining city. It's a Remainer city. Just thinking about, the European Union is our biggest market for the creative economy. So funding for culture comes from it. There's a lot of talent flow between Europe, between the UK. It's a really big issue and a big challenge for us. But more broadly, when the vote happened, we very quickly, with Sadiq, mounted a campaign called London is Open. And that was absolutely to signal immediately that London is an inclusive, open city, because people were feeling very, very fearful, afraid. It was a very divisive situation. It was framed as an issue around immigration. It wasn't. So the impact of Brexit has been, really, really devastating, honestly. So we at City Hall have been spending all of our energy really trying to kind of reverse that narrative in a way, and to really kind of push forward, the inclusion, the diversity of London, the fact that, as Helen said, there are 300 languages spoken every day on the streets here. It's the most international city in the world in that sense. And so, we've had a big kind of push called London is Open, which is kind of, it's a campaign, it's projects, it's strategy, it's an international focused thing, and it's a local focused thing. So we've got a lot of work to do because, and we've lost a lot of people,
Right.
People in my team from, who come from Barcelona felt very upset around Brexit, and people have been applying for passports because they wanted to stay here. Other people have gone home and they've stayed home, and it is a threat, really. It is a threat, I think, to our kind of internationalism. But I think that so far it looks post-COVID that things are rebalancing a bit. And people are coming back. But we've got work to do because it's who we are. It's our identity. Our identity is creative, it's international, it's inclusive, it's open. But we can't take that for granted. And we can't, in government and in London government, that's got to be.
I'm going to stop you and let Daniel pick up from there because I don't want to run out of time.
I was just going to add to what Justine said. Actually, I think the role of the pandemic and the relationship with Brexit's been very interesting because, in some ways, in my opinion, it's been, it was very, very divisive, and there was a lot of issues within families and communities. But one of the silver linings about the pandemic was it completely shifted on the debate. So, Brexit was all anybody talked about for a very long period of time. It was incredibly divisive, but the pandemic has wiped that out. I think there's still lots of issues there. But I think until we emerge from the pandemic, it's going to be quite hard to make an assessment of what the impact has been. It's very difficult to understand what's Brexit and what's pandemic, I think, at the moment. But the one helpful thing is it did quell the debate, has quelled the debate, I think, for a bit.
The mayor, I think, in December called it an existential crisis on the culture of London and the sort of population of London. Let me get to another question here. There are a couple of people asking about, interested in the energy types, biomass, wind, just curious. And I think probably addressed to you, Daniel, in the buildings that you were talking about, or in the East Bank. So Justine may have an answer for that.
I don't know what the energy solution is in the East Bank. Maybe Justine does, but I think so. We're currently using predominantly combined heat and power sort of community heating systems, which are, I guess, in the main are still gas fired. But there's a lot of work going on at the moment around how you would convert those, and quite a lot of interest in hydrogen power. And quite a lot of work being done to make an assessment of what infrastructure would be required to make London use hydrogen power, and we're looking at lots of things in the docks about how that could come in on boats and things, and there'd be plans for docking and other things.
Herbert Drysdale asks, tropical climate challenge. How do you cooperate with locals, with your NGOs and cities in Europe? I'm not sure who wants to pick that up.
I think so. I can say this, but I think Justine might know. I think the Sadiq is very big on the. I'm trying to think what it's called. Justine, is it C40?
Yeah. The C. Shall I answer it?
Yeah. Go for it. You probably know better.
So interesting. No, good question. No. Well, Ken Livingstone actually, he made his number one priority was the environment, climate change. It's the thing that he read about every night. So. That was the number one priority, and he pushed through the congestion charging zone, which was really radical, and no other city had done that. And he also set up a thing called the C40, which was global cities around the world saying, federal governments have not been able to crack the climate crisis or make as much progress. They're more kind of restricted in what they can do, and actually cities can act, cities can innovate, and when you look at where the emissions are coming from, by and large, the biggest proportion of emissions are coming from cities. So let's get cities together as an alliance and look at what we can do together. And that is what we can learn from each other. If someone's brilliant on transport, let's look at what they're doing on transport. If someone's brilliant on waste, let's look at what they're doing and learn from that. If someone's great on air quality, etc. And that kind of spun off after Ken left and became an independent organisation. And now Sadiq has actually just been appointed the chair of it. It's more than 40 cities now. There's loads more cities involved in it, but it's a big global movement. And so that is a lot of where the ideas and the innovation come from kind of peers in other cities through the C40. And I've set up a parallel kind of program called the World Cities Culture Forum, which is a little bit on that model. Ricky's been involved in it a bit, which is in a similar way, learning from all of my peers in 40 other global cities. So lots of the things we've been talking about today, like Tonya mentioned the Creative Land Trust. We stole that idea from San Francisco through the World Cities.
Yeah, well, that's how I really would love to end. You know, cities are distinct in their identities and their cultures and their issues. That's something that I think really came to mind for me in Ricky's book. This is not a one-size-fits-all model, but you have a wide audience of people working to shift thinking and working to change life and the culture of cities and keeping things vibrant. So quickly, if you don't mind, is there anything that you think, like London, this is what London has to teach the rest of us? I'm going to start with you, Tonya, because we haven't heard from you in a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think what London, can teach the rest of the world is how diverse communities can live together, because they have. And again, I just always point to, how, kind of class diversity and ethnic diversity within London and the different neighborhoods is so rich. And so I think that's something that should be seen and experienced by people, because I think you can take that back to wherever you're from. And again, I just think that confluence of culture, and what we didn't get to with the East Bank was the fact that it's culture and education. And I think universities and the role that universities, we've got top universities within London, are playing a role with public engagement and working with communities, I think is really interesting and really trailblazing. And then just, that mix again with the commerce and tech, which I didn't get to talk about, but partnerships with tech in terms of that creative inspiration and innovation, I think is really, really important.
Well, we are going to have breakout sessions. So if you want to stick around and people want to ask Tonya about that, that we do have to wrap. So Ricky, do you want to pick that up? What does London have to teach the rest of the world at this point in its placemaking game?
Well, that to remain global, you mustn't lose touch with the grassroots. Mm-hmm. And there's such a tendency for cities competing around the world to forget who they are and where they've come from. And this is not a nostalgic point. London hasn't stood still, but basically to have the courage to innovate. I mean, let's not forget, the government, the last Labour government from the 90s, had the courage to say, we should innovate our system of decision-making, policy-making. Let's have a directly elected mayor. Yesterday, Sadiq was the first mayor of a major global city to say, hey, let's try road pricing if we want to hit the COP26 targets, if we're serious, right? I mean, this is, it's radical stuff in many ways, but you mustn't lose touch with the people who can vote you in or out.
Daniel, how about you?
I know you've run out of time, so I'd say I agree completely with Tonya. It's about the cultural diversity and the mix of class and ethnicity, and go on a night out in London and you just meet anybody from. It's like sort of traveling around the world in one night. If you have a big night out in London, you just meet people from everywhere, and it's pretty amazing.
Justine, for you,
I think
have a Justine, have a Daniel.
I think to add. Embrace the chaos, I think. Go with the mess. Don't try to kind of over control it. I mean, one of the way in which I describe my work often is acupuncture. So, it's kind of finding that sweet spot where you can make a real difference as city government, that no one else has kind of got access to that point, and to address a kind of challenge in London, rather than trying to kind of master plan London or over control it or something. I think it's kind of embrace and kind of, own the mess, and then find the points at which you can make a really fantastic difference.
Justine Simons, Daniel Bridge, Ricky Burdett, Tonya Nelson, thank you so much for rich conversations. We really appreciate it. Thank you for being with us. And also thank you to Helen and the folks at Artichoke and Selena for putting this together. And thank you all, you Loebs, for your questions and the conversation. Coming up, we have a virtual tour of Amsterdam. So you have 15 minutes to stretch your legs, exchange your cup of tea for an espresso or whatever substance best aligns with Amsterdam for you. We're going to come back in 15 minutes. But if you would like to do some networking, go over to the networking hubs. You can just pop in and you can mingle. You can hop from one room to the next. That's going to route you to a smaller group. Just make sure and come back and join us on the main stage in 15 minutes. So that's 12:45 Eastern time. I'm sorry, I can't calculate GMT, but I was warned to never, ever do math during a broadcast. So thank you all for being with us.